Biceps brachii. The term biceps tells us that it has two heads, and the term brachii tells us that it runs along the length of the arm. And in anatomy, the arm refers specifically to the area along the humerus. It has a long head that is more lateral and a short head that is more medial. The proximal attachment of the long head is the supraglenoid tubercle of the scapula, and it also runs through and ties into the labrum of the glenohumeral joint. And the short head attaches to the coracoid process of the scapula. Distally, it has an attachment on the radial tuberosity, which is the proximal anterior surface of the radius, and the bicipital aponeurosis, which is a more superficial fascia that wraps around the proximal forearm. The actions of biceps brachii include flexion of the elbow joint, and more specifically that would be the humeroulnar and humeroradial joints, supination of the radioulnar and humeroradial joints, and flexion of the glenohumeral joint. The long head alone can do abduction of the glenohumeral joint. It is fairly close to the anterior-posterior axis, but it is lateral to that axis. And if you do a little bit of external rotation, it can get a little bit better leverage for doing abduction of the glenohumeral joint. And the short head can then do adduction of the glenohumeral joint. The line of pull relative to the glenohumeral joint is similar to coracobrachialis, but just a little bit less leverage. Brachialis lies deep to biceps brachii from an anterior view. In the picture, we have left biceps brachii in so you can see the relationship between the two muscles. And on the left arm, we have removed biceps brachii. Brachialis has a proximal attachment on the distal half of the anterior surface of the humerus and a distal attachment along the ulnar tuberosity and the coronoid process of the ulna. Both of those bony landmarks are on the anterior proximal surface of the ulna. And the sole action of brachialis is flexion of the elbow joint, which again more specifically is at the humeroulnar and humeroradial joint. Next we have brachioradialis, and we see a recurring theme with the names. Brachii referring to the arm and radi referring to the radius. The proximal attachment is along the lateral supracondylar ridge of the humerus, which is adjacent to and proximal to the lateral condyle of the humerus, and a distal attachment on the styloid process of the radius, which is along the distal lateral surface of the radius. The actions include flexion of the elbow joint, so that is along a medial lateral axis in the sagittal plane, and pronation and supination of the radioulnar and humeroradial joints to neutral. So if in a position of pronation, the muscle can supinate to neutral. If in a position of supination, it can pronate to neutral. Triceps brachii. Now we have a muscle with three heads that crosses the length of the arm. The three heads are the long head, the medial head, and the lateral head. And in actuality, the long head and the medial head are both medial, but the medial head is deep to the long head. In our picture on the left side, I've removed the long head of the triceps so we can see the medial head in pink and the lateral head in dark red. And then on the right arm, we have a bright red long head of the triceps brachii. Proximal attachments include the infraglenoid tubercle of the scapula. That is for the long head. That is the only head of the muscle that crosses the glenohumeral joint. And then the other two attach to the posterior surface of the humerus. The lateral head attaches along the proximal third of the humerus, and the medial head along the distal 2/3 of the humerus. They converge on the distal attachment at the olecranon process of the ulna, which is the posterior proximal part of the ulna. And then the actions as a group are extension of the elbow joint. So they are posterior to the medial lateral axis of the elbow, therefore they can perform extension. Then the long head only has an additional 2 actions at the glenohumeral joint. It can do extension of the humerus at the glenohumeral joint and adduction of the humerus at the glenohumeral joint. Anconeus. This is a small muscle that runs posterior to the elbow joint. It has a proximal attachment on the posterior surface of the lateral epicondyle of the humerus and a distal attachment along the proximal lateral surface of the ulna. Its only action is extension of the elbow joint, so it is the same action as the medial and lateral heads of the triceps brachii. Supinator. So supinator gets its name from its action rather than its location. It has a proximal attachment on the lateral epicondyle of the humerus and the proximal posterior surface of the ulna. Distally, it attaches to the proximal lateral surface of the radius, and its only action is supination of the radioulnar and humeroradial joints, which is a transverse plane action along the longitudinal or vertical axis of those joints. During standard action supination, if we start in a position of pronation, the radius is crossed over the ulna. Then as supinator contracts, the radius rotates relative to a stationary ulna and humerus so that the anterior surface of the radius starts to face anteriorly and the radius uncrosses from the ulna. Pronator Teres. So this name tells us about its function and its general shape. It will do pronation, and teres means circular, although in the context of muscular anatomy, it usually means a cylindrical shape. And Pronator Teres has 2 heads, even though you can typically only see one in a picture because they overlap. We have the longer humeral head and a deeper ulnar head. The proximal attachment is along the medial epicondyle of the humerus, so that would be the humeral head, and along the coronoid process of the ulna, so that would be the deeper ulnar head. The distal attachment for both is along the middle lateral surface of the radius, and then the actions would be pronation of the radioulnar and humeroradial joints, so that longitudinal axis along a transverse plane. And then the humeral head only actually runs anterior to the medial lateral axis of the elbow joint. Therefore, it can do flexion of the elbow. Next, we have Pronator Quadratus. The name tells us the primary action, pronation, and the shape, which is like a quadrilateral. The medial attachment is along the distal anterior surface of the ulna, and lateral attachment is along the distal anterior surface of the radius. Its sole action is pronation of the radioulnar and humeroradial joints. So that is the transverse plane action along the longitudinal axes of radioulnar and humeroradial joints.